Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today.
Speak on the mic.
I'll repeat. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to discuss the question of C.A.T.S. My name is Jeffrey Liss. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the National Space Society. I'm also editor of Inside NSS. I wear this I want to go button today, so there is no doubt at least where I'm coming from. A lot of question about where I'm going to get to. And I think that I probably started the focus of this discussion with a little editorial note in Inside NSS, whimsically or provocatively entitled "C.A.T.S, a Siren Song." And I might just start this out, if I may, by noticing that when I came into the hotel for the first time, I thought that the air conditioning in the hotel could have been kept a little cooler. That was something which I still think, and as soon as I say that, I'll take off the jacket. And then I said, well, why didn't this hotel use cooler air conditioning? After all, it's a great hotel. And then it occurred to me, the only reason to lower the air conditioning was to get more people. But if they wouldn't lose anybody by raising the air conditioning to the temperature where they got, it would be better off economically to settle for the warmer temperature. So in other words, the market would not give me cooler air conditioning. The only way I get cooler air conditioning would be some other source, not through allowing market forces in the hotel. And having said that, an analogy which I may or may not come back to later, I thought I'd ask David Anderman to give us a little overview on what I would call the theory and practice of C.A.T.S.
Theory and practice of C.A.T.S. Well, to begin with, the discussion originated on the NSS Discuss news group, largely between Jeffrey and myself. I intervened, came into the discussion to differentiate the traditional NSS position, National Space Society position, from the traditional Space Frontier Society position. Is everyone here familiar with Space Frontier Foundation? Excuse me. Has anyone ever heard of the Space Frontier Foundation? Thanks, Jim. All right, great. And before I get into that, I just want to mention the Space Frontier Foundation is holding a symposium on Capitol Hill in Washington on cheap access to space, July 21st, 22nd. You may have seen the publicity material that has been handed out. This event is free and open to the general public, no charge. However, you must register early. We have a limited number of seats for the general public. We'll have many industry leaders there, government officials, FAA regulators, possible investors in cheap access to space, NASA officials. It'll be a landmark event, much as the NASA roundtable 2 years ago in developing cheap access to space, and you're all invited. The traditional NSS approach to cheap access to space, and this is based on my own observation using content analysis, is simply applying full funding to NASA, giving NASA as much money as possible. Whereas the Foundation's approach has been much more, shall we say, surgical in nature. Those programs that we see as being beneficial for cheap access to space, we support, such as the early incarnations of X-33, the DCX. Those programs, on the other hand, that we find don't advance cheap access to space, or in some cases we see as being detrimental, such as the original X-34 program, we will actively oppose funding for, and that can be a very controversial position. And we have had many debates with NSS leadership on, for example, X-34, whereas we opposed X-34, NSS supported X-34, the original incarnation, which, if you don't know, was an experimental cargo carrying vehicle. With that, let me take it back to Jeffrey and see if I'd like to find out if you view my characterization of the NSS approach as being accurate.
I think the approach, from my perspective, which is someone who has not been in the forefront of NSS policymaking, a little simplistic. Let me give you some history of NSS support for or against NASA or NASA projects as an illustration of the problem we face. A number of years ago, the question came up as to whether or not NSS should support the building of the space station. And this was a very difficult issue that year. We spent many months in discussion, and at the ISDC that year, the chapters assembly, representing the chapters, spent a lot of time on the issue, and the board of directors and the policy committee spent a lot of time on the issue. And eventually, it turned out to be pretty good consensus that we thought that this was the wrong space station in the wrong place at the wrong time. But on the other hand, we felt that this was going to be the only space station or the only off-planet habitat for people that we were likely to get within the next 2 or 3 decades, or more vividly for some of us, in our lifetimes. And that if we did not support the space station and the space station were canceled, that this money would not go into something we thought more productive, like a different kind of space station, a lunar settlement or at least exploration program, and that it may also have meant the death of any kind of human space transportation system, because it would have left the shuttle with only basically science missions, which might have been able to be handled more inexpensively by existing ELDs, which would have been would have made a lot longer the road to space. So essentially, the NSS position then was, we support the space station, we support whatever full funding is necessary to build it. Now, talking about this year, full funding for NASA or something, it's very hard where I am in Chicago, 1,000 miles away from the Beltway, to find out exactly what is happening. What I see in the papers is there's a proposal to cut $500 million from NASA's budget. Now, I see this with a bludgeon, not with a scalpel. I don't know that that's coming from Program A, Program B, Program C. What I am pretty damn sure about is that even if NASA could spend that $500 million better some other way, if NASA's not spending it, if it's cut, it ain't going back to NASA to spend some other way, it's going to somewhere else, away from the space program. And not only is it going away from the space program, it's setting a new low ceiling or floor, depending on how you look at it, for space funding. And that strikes me as something very badly, something very bad that we want to avoid. Now, within NSS, I know we work where we can, and I will say we're not as vocal or vociferous or as public as we try to nudge NASA into spending its money more efficiently and more appropriately. We support, in general, the efforts of Dan Golden. I believe we have been critical of NASA in different points, or should we say quiet, when they might have looked for our support. But it's hard for me to tell at that small scale level what programs are this, what programs are that. I think at this point I'd like to introduce our other two people up here. On my left is Gordon Woodcock, who is the new Executive Vice President of the National Space Society, and thus becomes the head of our new policy committee. And Gordon cannot be held responsible for any past sins of the policy committee, because he is new. And one of the advantages, of course, is we get to take a fresh look at things. On my far left is Mark Holthouse, who is a member of our board of directors from California. And Mark has made what I think is an extremely significant contribution to the discussion of C.A.T.S, which of course is the acronym for Cheap Access to Space. Mark reminds us that the watchword for us is not C.A.T.S, but CHATS, Cheap Human Access for Space. And that is a very important distinction to remember, to keep in mind when we remember we're supporting C.A.T.S, is to don't lose sight of the long-term goal. Now I think I'll turn this over to Gordon for his perspective on what NSS does and doesn't say with respect to NASA, at least in the past, and what we may or may not expect in the future.
Well, I'd like to start by saying that I'm pretty new to the policy committee position, so don't hold the policy committee responsible for anything I might say in this meeting. I can't tell if this microphone's working or not, is it? It's okay. The question of cheap access to space is, well, for years I've held the view that the cheap access to space will only occur when the private sector finds it profitable to provide that service. Tom Rogers used to say that there are some things that governments just can't do, and you don't blame governments particularly for that, because just like you don't blame dogs for barking, dogs bark, that's what dogs do. One of the things governments don't do is save money. And so if you want something to be cost effective, it needs to come from the private sector. Given that, if you want a true private sector initiative to do something, whatever the something is, it doesn't even have to do with space, you really need to satisfy three groups of people. One group of people is the engineers, what is technically possible for a given sum of money. A second group of people is customers, what will you buy and how much of it will you buy? And the third group of people is the financiers who will put up the money to finance the initial development of some new product before it attracts revenue to be self-supporting. That's a very old story, and it's one that we often don't pay enough attention to. One of the difficulties today with the whole business of C.A.T.S is that presently the aerospace community generally looks to the aerospace industry to finance C.A.T.S, to Lockheed Martin or Boeing, or that's about where it's left, I guess. McDonnell Douglas merger is with Boeing has not gone forward yet, and there seems to be a great deal of controversy arising from Europe. But assuming that it does eventually go forward, there are really only two companies in the aerospace flying machine big business that are capable of doing such a thing. They are not generally run by economists. They're run by engineers and business people who are used to doing business with the government. I have retired from Boeing over a year ago. I am not privy to any Boeing business secrets, and if I were, I wouldn't discuss them at this meeting. But it is generally true that the aerospace industry executives believe that the market for space transportation is not very elastic. That is to say, if I cut the price in half, I would have to sell twice as many flights simply to break even on revenue. Most of them do not believe that if they cut the price in half, they'll sell twice as many flights. They believe they'll sell 1.5 to something like that number of flights. Therefore, it's really not in their business interests, and I raised that recently in a little article I wrote for Jeff Liss's newspaper, in which I said, do you really believe these guys want C.A.T.S? And I said, I don't. There are, in addition to the major aerospace companies, something like 20 small entrepreneurial companies that are trying to get into the space transportation business, generally looking to the small launch market, which seems to be, in which demand seems to be greatly outstripping the current supply. And I'm speaking of the Iridiums and the Teledesics and all of these people who want to put satellites in low Earth orbit. And some of them want to put fairly large numbers of satellites in low Earth orbit. And the demand for that, given a little bit of success on the pioneers like Iridium, is going to outstrip the supply quite rapidly. And the small innovative suppliers have at least a chance of breaking into the space transportation business by satisfying that market, because the big guys can't, because their lead times are too darn long. That market is also probably highly elastic, and there's every reason to believe that it is elastic enough to make it much worth the while of anyone who supplies that market to cut prices as low as they can, because they'll make more money. Also, since there are a large number of contenders, an obvious reason for cutting prices is to gain market share. If there's only 2 or 3 contenders, you often find that market share somehow magically becomes reasonably divided among the 2 or 3 contenders so that all of them do okay. But if there are a large number of contenders, that doesn't seem to happen. And in this case, for the small launch market, there are quite a number. So I've got a few more things to say, but I'd like to pass it on to Mark at this point, and I'll come back later.
Well, I'm a new employee at Boeing. We used to be Rockwell in Downey. And one of the observations that I've made over time is how much NASA is really into getting the average citizen into space. They are gearing up to make the shuttle last in the year 2030 because they don't believe anybody else is going to be able to launch people. Now, they're hedging their bets, of course, with X-33 and Future X and all this stuff, but when is that going to happen. The other thing is that Zuber was next door talking about how many satellites there are to be launched and what commercial space means today. It means a lot of bucks. But the thing is, like Gordon was saying, is there's a lot of small boosters. Well, small expendable boosters don't equal manned space access. We want manned space access. The C.A.T.S versus C.A.T.S thing. Our goal of the National Space Society is to put humans in space in, 25 people in orbit by the year 2010 or something like that. Well, you aren't going to do it with small boosters. But things like the X Prize I see as very promising type things because they are talking about launching people on vacations. Once they win the prize, they expect to keep on going. I know Burbertan is thinking about having a resort where you can go through astronaut training and fly in his vehicle. Eventually, Pioneer rocket plane plans on flying people, but as you notice next door, that was only after they start doing long distance package delivery. What we've done with the shuttle is basically what Lewis and Clark has done. They've explored the new frontier. The Louisiana Purchase is low Earth orbit. Now we've got to get the Mountain Men into orbit before we start sending Pioneers to get up there. What these Mountain Men are going to be are the X Prize guys. They're risking their lives. They're flying by the seat of their pants, and they don't know that they're going to come back. They're sure going to try hard. That's what I want to have us promote. David will always say, and maybe even Ben Muniz will always say, well, we've got to really push commercial space. Well, I'd say pick out the guys who have the manned launch as part of their business plan and help those guys along. And most of those guys are all reusable launch vehicles. So that's my opinion.
Thank you. I think we'll give this back to David. I want to say one thing first. It should be very, very clear that the position of the National Space Society is to vigorously support C.A.T.S efforts at reducing commercial barriers to space and the whole panoply of concepts. The real issue, I think, is C.A.T.S or C.A.T.S plus. And with that, I'll turn it over to David.
Well, the original issue here is the position of NSS versus the position of the foundation on cheap access to space. Unfortunately for the National Space Society, their positions seem to be supporting everything. And so the bottom line gets back to, given they support everything, where do they put their resources? And their resources, day in, day out, 90% are involved in supporting full funding for NASA. I've got a question from the audience, though. You're all here pretty much in your own dime. How many people are interested in cheap access space because they themselves want to go into space? Let's use a show of hands. All right. How many people here believe that full funding for NASA is going to get you into space? Raise your hands. How many people believe the private sector ultimately can get you into space? That you eventually can buy a ride? Okay. So Jeffrey, given that people here don't seem to believe that full funding for NASA is going to get them into space, and given that the goal of the National Space Society is getting people into space, can you explain that contradiction?
Yeah, easy. The key word was ultimately. Ultimately. I don't have ultimately to wait. I have a fairly simplistic view, and it's not a question of how much resources for this or how much resources for that. It's how much resources at the strategic point are necessary to push along commercial legislation versus how much resources are needed to push along something else. Now, my fundamental problem is this. While the private industry is working on C.A.T.S, if all the space advocates are working on C.A.T.S, who is working on getting people out of Earth's atmosphere and onto the moon or Mars or asteroids? There is nobody. And there is not a chance in the world that in the next 30 years anybody's going to come up with a commercially viable proposal for to settle people on the moon or on Mars or on the asteroids. The commercial return simply is not visible on the horizon to the people who would finance this. I do not see any one of these private ventures doing anything more than sending people to low Earth orbit in the next 2 or 3 decades. So, what is it that I think is missing? I think that NSS should be continuing to do what it's always done, is push, prod, cajole, yell at, spank the government, and saying the government should do in space what governments were always set up to do. Do the things that are important for a society that do not make market sense or that individuals themselves cannot afford to do. And that was sending out Lewis and Clark, it was building Boulder Dam, it was building the Panama Canal. In the next 2 or 3 decades, the only foreseeable way in which we are going to get the settlement or human exploration of the other worlds is if we can induce the government to launch a program to do it. And I will say something here. When I talk about launching a program, I say that with a very strong caveat. I would not support a program that works like Apollo, a 1 or 2 time grab rocks and return type thing. I would only support a program which is part of a long-term effort to keep people there permanently, and every mission will incrementally expand the presence where we are going. But that is what I think that NSS is uniquely positioned and philosophically set up to do. We're not set up for tourist rides, although that is a great start. It will get people more interested. It gets some increase in our space capacity, and I support it fully. But I don't think we should lose sight of the main chance, which is getting a regular development program of the other worlds done sooner, rather than waiting 30 years for C.A.T.S to be here and then start with that and see where we go. That's one reason why NSS has been pushing what's called a Phase A study of a Mars mission. Phase A study is not inexpensive, it's not building a Mars mission, it's not setting architecture, it's basically saying what would be involved, let's find out the facts, the cost, then we can go on from there. And there's still an argument as to whether or not Moon or Mars should be our first target and so forth. And again, those are what I call sub-issues to the issue here, is whether or not we should be in a C.A.T.S mode or a C.A.T.S plus mode. And the debate I have has been C.A.T.S plus. Good?
Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about this whole business roles of governments and roles of private industry and roles of public advocacy organizations. And I'll try to keep this brief, but we need to recognize what we are. We're a public advocacy organization. We can do very little, if anything at all, to influence a board of directors of a company or a group of financiers to put money into any project or another. We may, in some cases, be able to either contribute an idea or offer a convincing argument that it might be a good idea, that it might be a good thing to finance, but we have no real leverage on these people other than the leverage of ideas. We do collectively have some leverage on what governments can do. And I agree with Jeffrey, one of the things that governments can do is to explore the frontier. The initial explorations, to my knowledge, historically have never had a return on investment that would satisfy financiers. I know of a couple of failures. The Jamestown colony was privately financed, it went broke. There have been a couple of other examples. A true frontier for settlement exists when the settlers select themselves and can afford to pay the price to go wherever it is they want to go, and can support themselves when they get there, at least to the degree of self-sufficiency to be able to sustain their existence. In the days of the Old West, you could pretty well put everything you needed to sustain your self-existence in your Conestoga wagon. If you get to the Moon or Mars, it's a little more complicated, and today the technology does not exist at any price to sustain one's existence. We need, certainly, in order for people to be able to pay their way to the frontier, we need C.A.T.S. We need C.A.T.S that's much cheaper than anybody thinks, than anybody currently talks about. And if you look at what the ultimate lower bound of the cost of space transportation is with known technology, and by that I mean chemical energy fuels, there are no convincing stories of doing it any other way from the surface of the Earth to low Earth orbit. The lower bound is pretty hard to fix upon because it involves many questions about a great number of technologies, but it's somewhere in the range between $10 a pound and $50 a pound. It's 2 or 3 times international air freight, maybe 5 times international air freight. It's some fairly modest number. We're 2 and a fraction orders of magnitude greater than that. The cheapest ride you can get today is around $5,000 a pound for satellite cargo to low Earth orbit. Let me throw out a couple of broad rule of thumb economic numbers that are subject to a certain amount of change based on a whole lot of variables, but the moon tends to be about 10 times as expensive as low Earth orbit, and Mars tends to be at least several times more expensive than the moon, particularly if it's privately financed and you have to pay for the time value of money. If you think of the space tourism market begins to make some sense to a businessman somewhere around $1 million a ticket. I suspect there are probably at least not many people in this room who could afford to pay $1 million for a ticket into low Earth orbit, no matter how badly they wanted to go. But if you look worldwide, there are enough that probably would to make tourism begin to make sense as a marginal business, not as a mainstream business, somewhere around $1 million a ticket. What I mean by marginal business is if you had the vehicle that could fly people at $1 million a ticket, it would make sense to outfit one of them to do so. If you had to develop the vehicle to support that $1 million per ticket market, it probably does not make sense. But if, for example, you had a Venture Star vehicle, or I don't care what it looks like, and you could operate it cheaply enough to carry somewhere between 20 and 50 people at $1 million a ticket, you would sell probably a few trips a year. The tourist market is like many markets, and I would name such things as personal computers, a very highly elastic market, which means that if you reduce the price some, you increase the sales a lot. There have been some estimates, including some on my part, to estimate the elasticity, and the estimate that I come up with is if you reduce the price by a factor of 10, you increase the sales by a factor of 1,000. So it's a very lucrative market to go after once you have been able to enter the market in a marginal way. It is likely to progress rapidly towards the lower bound of launch costs, which ultimately leads to ticket prices in the general vicinity of $10,000 to $50,000. If I believe that the low Earth orbit tourist market can go to that kind of a limit, and if I continue to believe the factor of 10 to go to the moon, then when tourism to low Earth orbit reaches that level, tourism to the moon begins to make sense as a commercial market. But then you run into a problem. And that is that it would certainly make sense for a private venturer at that point of low-cost transport to Earth orbit to build a lunar-capable vehicle, perhaps somewhat like the one that was in the movie 2001. It might look something like that. And fly people to the moon for a couple of days to kind of look around, see the sights, maybe look at some historical sites and so forth, and come home. But you can't go much further than that because the technology to sustain people on that frontier does not exist today, and no private venture is going to put up the money. And therein lies one of the roles for government. If we want to be able to sustain human life on either the moon or on Mars, the government is going to have to step in and provide the pioneering and the technology and the development to make that sort of thing possible.
Can the audience say anything?
Sure, yeah.
Excuse me for interrupting, but David is outnumbered 3-1, and you all are giving speeches, and I'd like to hear a debate, and I'd like to see the public involved. Do you think? I mean, is that what this is about, or are you all just giving speeches?
We're talking about different aspects of C.A.T.S. We all have slightly different views. I know mine are different from Mark's, and Gordon's are different from mine in many respects. We had a number of debates. And we do expect to throw this open to the audience in due time.
By the way, I've said all I want to say until we throw it open to the audience.
Do you have anything to add, Mark?
Well, I think one of the issues is what David was talking about, full funding for NASA and how NSS has kind of been pushing towards that. I kind of don't like the idea of full funding for NASA, even though I do work on a lot of NASA projects. The thing that kind of outrages me is the point that NASA says that they're going to run the shuttle to 2030 because they don't think anybody else is going to be able to handle that job. And then you flip it over on the other side. We've convinced them now that they need to commercialize the shuttle. So they're trying to push that off to a commercial outfit, but yet NASA still feels that they're going to control everything that's going to be launched. And they will actively oppose anybody who's trying to launch something similar to their own space station. And
They have good track history there too.
right, our role should be is to try to keep both public, industry, and government informed about what's going on. What surprised me is I was sitting behind the McDonnell Douglas guy next door while they were talking about Pioneer rocket plane, and he was furiously scribbling down notes about what was going on. And what we're doing here at ISDC is getting everybody together, and they're hearing other sides of the coin, and there's probably about 20 sides to every coin that we flip around here. And that is basically our role as public outreach, try to get them involved and try to keep up front the fact that, yes, we want people to go into space, yes, we want commercial stuff to go because it'll help pay for it, and we want it to be cheap. So I'm kind of like a hybrid between Jeff and David.
What's your alternative
Alternative to what?
to NASA being controlled?
Well, the thing is that the FAA is out there, and we fly planes all the time, but we don't have hundreds of FAA employees in a control room watching an airplane fly. If we operated aircraft, except for cross-country traffic, they aren't running the airplanes themselves. If we had NASA running the airplane industry, we would have more than a quarter of the U.S. in the FAA supporting the aircraft.
Four airplanes.
Well, not for, if we had as many airplanes as we have today. So what I want NASA to do is more research, more basic exploration like the outer planets, searching for life around other stars. The stuff that you normally do for research, I'd like to see them to get out of the environmental thing with their observation system. I think there's other government agencies that are better to handle that. If they say they need to launch satellites to observe Earth, gee, I think we've got a whole bunch of companies that make Earth observation satellites without any help from NASA. Now, if you want to develop some new kind of sensor and it's going to be real expensive, let's have NASA help us. Or if we have to figure out what long-term space exposure is going to do to the human body, build a space station and we'll check that out before we go off to Mars. But you know, there are other concepts. Rockwell, now Boeing, had come up with concepts of sending people to Mars a long time ago. By the way, but without the help of NASA. The only thing they did was supply the money. And there was a space exploration initiative at one point for that. So have NASA do the researchy stuff, let industry handle the building the vehicles and the normal operation things. What NSS should do is keep the public and industry and government informed about what's going on. Get us together.
I think there's some fear out there. We always hear that, in the minds of a lot of the citizens out there, that every time we get private industry and government together, the private industry seems to be able to rape the government.
This is true.
Well, the thing is, though, they let it happen.
No,
The government lets themselves.
and I'm one that believes it myself. I think industry allows
The
that.
government's the people.
Because they come in and undershoot, and then they come back and expect money for their mistakes.
Question for Mark.
Okay.
You said government shouldn't be building launch vehicles. I'm not sure what launch vehicles the government has built. All the launch vehicles I know about come out of McDonnell Douglas, Rockwell, formerly Rockwell.
Let me think of how to answer that one.
Do you want
Most.
to take that?
Government designs vehicles.
Department of Defense.
Well, even the commercial outfit probably designs it, but government is tightly intertwined with how they do it. Most of the
You mean specifications should be coming from NASA?
well, Look, I guess I have to take a couple things back. One, when I say government, the launch vehicles that we're flying today, a lot of them were designed by the Air Force and Army. We have Deltas and Titans and Atlases. Those were Air Force design jobs.
But didn't
were
they
the
come out of
ones who-
national security
Right, they laid out the
considerations?
requirements for national security. They were in there with you, making sure that you built them to deliver nuclear warheads.
Let's back to David. David is,
Let's take some questions.
okay.
I might note that the current generation of launch vehicles, while they're descended from the ICBMs, are steadily evolving away from the purely government specification, government requirements design. As the companies, as NASA in the early 90s spun off the launch services and semi-privatized these companies. At first it was a very rocky road, but the companies have increasingly taken a independent course from the purely government subcontractor level and are moving on significantly reducing the vehicle's return costs and increasing their capability on their own. And this is part and parcel of moving away from the government being the launch supplier and the space access supplier. It's only a partial move. But in 1990, something like the Pegasus space plane and Orbital Sciences inventing their own transfer upper stage had a very high giggle factor for investors. And it was a significant role, if I remember, that NASA played as an anchor tenant for both vehicles.
Is there a question?
Yeah, what's your question?
It's another speech.
Yeah, I guess my point is simply the funding level for NASA helps keep a healthy ceiling room above a lot of these other things, but we do want to push NASA in useful directions.
My name is Jim Benson. I'm sorry for my impatience, but I'm getting older every minute, and I want to go to space. I have three comments to make. One is cheap human access to space is just a subset of cheap access to space. If we don't build the infrastructure up there, there's going to be nothing to go to for humans. So let's get the cost down and cheap for everything, and then we can have business and industry and a reason for humans to be in space. Secondly, engineers have looked at the production lines for the Delta and the other rockets. They're still hand building these things with 1960 manual techniques, and everybody knows these things could be built for half or less. Intel, which dominates the market for computer chips as much as McDonnell Douglas and LML and Lockheed Martin dominate the launch services, Intel tells business when they're going to be lowering their prices on the chips quarter by quarter out a couple of years so that manufacturers and customers can gear up their equipment and their sales to match that. Why doesn't Lockheed and McDonnell Douglas say, okay, number one, let's cut our costs by 50% through manufacturing techniques, and secondly, let's announce publicly declining launch costs if these volumes are met. They can do it, but they're not going to, because it's a government subsidized monopoly.
They are doing it. That was my point.
Baloney, they're not doing it. It cost me $50
Let's
million to
wait,
get a Delta,
Carol?
and that price is not going down.
Yeah, I was just, my thought is that I don't see that full funding for NASA and promoting everything that can be done to make it cheaper access to space from the private sector are should have to be competing goals. NASA's money and the money from private entrepreneurs do not come from the same place. And I think that there is a place for NASA. I think anything that gets access to space cheap is good, but I don't think that has to mean that you don't support what NASA can do.
Carol, I'd like to answer that concretely. What happens often is private companies come up with new ideas for launch technologies, and entrepreneurs will mortgage their house to finance these new developments. At the same time, people at NASA see the same technology, the same technique, realize that it's a good idea, and they'll go to Congress and say, you know, we'd like to do, as an example, aerial refueling of an aircraft using liquid oxygen. Let's transfer liquid oxygen from a tanker to an aircraft. Now, for, say, Pioneer Spaceplane, that's a key technology they've got to prove out. At the same time, the folks at NASA, they realize that hey, that's something that's sexy. That's something that Congress will allow us to do. So the pioneers of the world, for example, may not get the contract for that technology. Boeing might get the contract. And so for investors of Pioneer, as a concrete example, that could be a body blow. So full funding for NASA, giving NASA the money is a mixed blessing. Often the space agency will crush you in its embrace. There have been many other companies that have had significant.
But is that necessarily bad as long as the technology gets developed and it's available?
It's sort of the ordinary monopoly situation, or look at it in the airline situation. A new upstart airline lowers its cost, the big ones come in and say, we can do it better at the same price, and nobody invests or flies the small one goes, the big one goes back to business as usual.
You cannot compete with
That's
the government.
the risk.
That's the problem.
And we get back to a certain murkiness here about what full funding for NASA means, because we don't really know exactly what is being proposed to being cut. It's all become almost a symbolic argument, where my argument has been, I want to push NASA to spending lots of money on things that the private sector will never be doing. And I can do that at the same time I support C.A.T.S. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question that I want you to answer, David. Jeff, you can answer this. Let's say that the proposal is that we're going to increase NASA's budget, okay? Let's say one of the proposals is they're going to fund the Phase A by increasing. Let's say the other proposal is they're going to increase NASA's budget to make certain modifications to the shuttle so that it can fly longer or be more effective. Now, are you going to support them equally? In other words, are you going to have the same support for the one proposal as the other? Because that's what I think I understand you saying. In other words, no matter what NASA says they want, we support it. On the other hand, do we just support programs that make sense and oppose programs that don't make sense? Because if that's what we're doing, that's the difference. And so when I hear full funding, I'm not sure. I think maybe you're saying whatever NASA proposes, that's what we accept. If that's the proposal, if that's what you're saying, then I have a problem. So I want you specifically to answer those two concepts. If those are the two proposals, are you going to react exactly the same way?
Well, as a matter of fact, that's a real easy one for me, because yes, I'd like to see NASA do a Phase A study. What was the second one? The shuttle for 30 years. I don't rightly know at the moment what the odds are of actually having space transportation for humans after the current design useful life of the shuttle. And I'd be very much scared of not having anything. To not support expansion of the shuttle, based on my limited knowledge, I defer to other people after a study of that, might mean that I'm taking a hell of a gamble that we have left with a period of no space transportation. So I might be inclined to support that too. Now someone says, but NASA also wants to do a flyby of Pluto before the atmosphere freezes. Would you support that? Yes, I would support that. Someone says, do you want to do a probe of Europa and a long-term exploration there? The answer is, even though that's not particularly part of NSS's mission, yes, I do, because I think it would have long-term significance for us. And what next thing you know, the budget goes from $13.5 billion to $18 billion. Yes, I can support that, because they're all doing things I like. Now, if somebody says NASA wants to spend $50 million to stymie the development of private small launchers, I would oppose that if I had the option on that basis.
But Jeff, they're never going to say that.
They'll never have the stymie the small boys. They'll never happen.
I mean, you're going to have to evaluate
They'll call it bantam
But if my
instead.
choice is to support a Phase A study, yes or no, my answer is yes. That's all.
Okay.
Let's take some more questions. Harry, let's
Yes.
get Harry here.
As a participant in this thing, I'm interested in full funding for my company, Advent Launch Services. And one thing that would help us would be if the securities laws were changed so that we could actually go out and advertise to get people to invest in our various schemes and deals. So,
Use the word scheme.
well,
Business opportunities.
Business opportunities.
I think we all feel that regulatory reform is high on the agenda, and particularly since it's a non-economic item that we, and sometimes, by the way, by pushing Congress to support things like space stations, Martian studies, will get them to say, I can't do that, but get off my back, I'll support easing the regulations for you.
Isn't that sort of a Rube Goldberg way of going about getting some changes?
I don't believe the government was ever known as a logical creation. But I mean, that's just a fringe.
But you're
we
presenting
agree with
yourself as being a logical creature up here talking to us.
As a point of order, NSS does not take a position on the regulations of the Securities Exchange Commission.
Right.
That's a point of order.
What about FAA licensing of reusable launch vehicles?
That's not his issue.
I mean, essentially, NSS takes more likely to take a position on a specific proposal rather than a generic idea in terms of lobbying for something. We would not lobby generically for easier security regulations because, from a legal point of view, there's some of them that are awfully relevant. But somebody has a proposal that makes sense, get behind it. Try to incorporate it in one of the omnibus space commercialization bills. Try to sneak it in any way we can. We've been doing that for years, just like the foundation has.
But doesn't that play favoritism, though, to someone's particular? If you ever did one of these Bantam projects, you'll find, or one of these deals, you'll find that it's aimed at someone, and your deal doesn't. You're not going to stand a chance.
No.
So,
No.
Isn't that along the same lines as the tax break for the auto industry automaker that was done, who incorporated on a specific day in a specific state?
so why not go for
The government's always doing things like that.
Overall generic solution. To loosen the securities laws for space-based operations. For anyone who wants to do a solar-powered satellite, the securities laws would be relaxed so that they could go out and advertise, here you can buy a share of this for $10.
The problem is it won't fly. You can't hit a specific area. You'd have to attack it on a generic that we should establish laws that permit investment in entrepreneurial areas to further stimulate the U.S. economy, not simply limit it to space. If you try limiting it to space, it's going to be shot down.
Well, change all the laws.
Yeah, and that's what you have to do.
You talk to a lot of the space companies, and you're the first one that's mentioned changing the securities laws. It just hasn't come up before, that's all. That's why I'm saying we haven't taken it.
I was only going to comment. I was only going to comment that the securities laws are a little bit out of our purview, and there are enough crooks already in the securities business that I think relaxing the securities laws might be regarded as not overall productive. I would like to specifically answer Ransom's question from my point of view. He proposed two hypothetical NASA projects. One of them was upgrades for the shuttle, and the other was Phase A. And I'm going to give you my personal opinion on both of those very quickly. I do not believe, I'm all in favor of a Phase A study for going to Mars. I do not believe we should institutionalize the idea that Phase A studies require a line item in the NASA budget. That's a very bad idea. And the second one on shuttle improvements, if an improvement in the shuttle is needed to make it safer for crews to fly, I'm in favor of it. If it's supposed to make the shuttle cheaper, I suspect the money is better spent on X-planes.
All right. This one comes from the Government Executive magazine of a couple months ago. The chief of the United Space Alliance, which is the organization that's going to be running the shuttle, is now talking about getting the shuttle back to the commercial satellite launch business and pushing the launch rates up to the order of 12 a year. Panel's opinions. I personally think it's a bad idea.
Their point is, though, that if they're going to privatize it, then shouldn't they have opportunity to go into the private market?
Can I answer that? Yeah. Okay. Given that they don't own the shuttles are not privatized. USA is merely a prime contractor. They don't own the vehicle, they don't have title to it. The only condition in which I could see that happening is if they would be able, if they paid the true cost of launching a shuttle, not the marginal cost, but the actual cost of launching the shuttle. And I suspect there's not a payload in the world that is valuable enough that they could make a profit off that.
Back there in the green?
I'll address this to you, Jeff.
way long time ago, you talked about how space tourism is not going to get human presence on Mars and the asteroid belt, and you're absolutely right. But what space tourism will do, and why we desperately need it, is to make people believe again that it is possible for them to go.
You're absolutely right.
As long as people don't believe that anymore, you're not going to get support. This organization is going to continue to shrink. I was here 2 years ago at ISDC in Cleveland. This place looks like a ghost town by comparison. And I think the reason for that is that more and more people are giving up. Until we turn that attitude around, we don't have a chance. And I think space tourism is going to do that.
I agree with you, and I think that space tourism is, particularly in near Earth space, either atmospheric or orbital, is likely to rekindle that interest and will be an offshoot of whatever C.A.T.S we do get right now. And I'm a vigorous supporter, everything from Advent to Aldrin. I mean, let's try it to fly and see if we can do it. I mean, it's almost like I have a Heinlein juvenile novel where people are building rockets in their backyard, it seems like. And I'm just hoping that that will prove fruitful and do that. But once people get interested in space, you're still talking about you're still neglecting, you're still not jumping from there to getting people on the moon or Mars, except by starting to push the government then. And my only point is, I want to keep pushing the government right now to start the base of work.
I'm going to agree with you about that too.
Bob, you got a question? The other green? Did you have a question?
Yes. I get the impression that if NASA went away, some would say that private industry would quickly build up and there would be people going into space again. There would be, in fact, a rapid influx of people. I'd like to understand from David, if my assumption is correct, disagree with me if I'm reading you wrong, how soon would it be before we see the same number of people going into space as NASA is now?
In the event that NASA were to disappear tomorrow, over the next...
Thought experiment.
What's that?
As a thought experiment.
As a thought experiment? In the first year, you'd have 0 people going to space. The second year, you might get 0. But at some point in time, you'd have an explosion of people going into space.
How long?
I don't know, Chuck.
That's a very real question. Because,
3 to 5 years.
3 to 5 years, you'd have an explosion. If the national requirement to put people in space were satisfied by the private sector, it would explode. The same as in any technology in the past the government abandoned, the private sector entered the fray with an explosion. Whether it's whether it's computers, you name it, the private sector does it better. If you're arguing the government does it more efficiently than the private sector, I suspect nobody in the room would argue, would agree with
Do
you.
you see the private sector going to the moon?
When it's economically viable.
When do you ever see any possibility?
A lot, let's put it this way, the people in this room would get to the moon personally a lot faster than if we relied on the government to do it. Because if you rely on the government, you'll never get to the moon. You, Jeffrey, will never get to the moon. You rely on the government. Some civil servant might, but not you.
My daughter may work for the government and get there. Yeah, and at least we have.
And you might win the lottery.
At least we have people on the moon. We have, right now, there's no prospect of the private market sending people to the moon and keeping them there permanently. There's a better chance with the government. Yeah.
I think it's interplay obvious, and I don't want to be argumentative about that because you can't win that argument either way. It's going to take both.
That shouldn't stop us from being argumentative in this room.
Okay, well then I'll keep talking. I think this man's comment about securities laws was more apt than you were giving it credit for, because I know in a business setting, by the time you write a prospectus or something for the SEC, your risk factors at any space adventure take up more pages than anything, and it's a turnoff. But we're not going to change that. Is probably a good thing, because the SEC tends to weed out people, But I think the trade-off is that if they're going to require a high-risk admission, then they ought to give us investors a write-off, a tax write-off under 174 R&D expenses, which you can't get now. I mean, it's just literally impossible. It's the courts have destroyed 174 for investors. Well, that would even be better. That would even be better. That's a bottom line situation. That kind of thinking, I think, is the kind of thing we should be advancing in Congress. And the government could help in that way.
Does anyone know whether your NSS or the foundation have incorporated the tax aspects of R&D in any of our bills?
Yes, we have spent an excruciating amount of time on tax reform. And a lot of people have worked with, for example, ProSpace, represented by Charles Miller, spent their own money to go to Washington to work that very issue. We couldn't get NSS to support that. We couldn't get NSS to help with that effort.
There's a lot going on here, but that's beside the point.
Can I make a comment about that as a tax attorney?
Yeah.
I have never seen tax credits accomplish what they intended to do. People always figure out ways, scheming ways, to get around them and get the credit without accomplishing the goal. And I always have a problem with those. I think there's got to be a better way of utilizing the money or promoting the notion than trying to use credits to do it.
Yeah.
Two things. First, I think we're getting into exactly what Mr. Bova was talking about, the either-or fallacy, that it's either one or the other. There's no logical reason why we can't have both a private and a public sector occupation. Well, they're transforming what you're saying into other things.
The private sector can't compete with the government.
And the second thing is, I'm wondering if we're not, if we maybe should not be looking at more along the lines of the Apple IBM PC model thing. IBM, the giant in computers, assumed there would never be any major market for personal computers and didn't pursue them. Apple came out of the homebrew computer clubs and stuff like that, and essentially developed out of things. We hear, as Jeff was saying, people are practically building rockets in their backyards. Zubrin is talking, gave a very good presentation in there about taking what was essentially Dark Horse, Dark Colt, and jimmying it into a practical vehicle that he says he can get flying in 3 years if he can get the initial financing for it. So I'm wondering if we're tearing ourselves up here when we should be looking under the right rocks to find who's going to turn into the next Apple.
Imagine if IBM had the ability to regulate Apple. That's where we are now.
Right.
The government can regulate the little guys under the rocks.
Actually, Apple was trying to regulate the little
But
guys.
but are they? 9 times out of 10, the government doesn't know what it's doing to itself, let alone doing to others.
This is the 10th time.
Yeah.
Is it a matter of the economic people with the most power, the ones that are benefiting the most from this relationship? I would ask, is it possible that our biggest obstacle in this whole situation is that we've got now 2 giant major aerospace companies and the U.S. government, and they're the only ones that have any power or any control over any real changes, and they have absolutely no vested interest in any changes because it's going to cost them money?
I don't know if that's a rhetorical question or not. I think there is some merit, and I think inside NSS and some editorial notes I've raised that same question. I think Gordon has said very clearly that when you have a large company that's already got a huge investment in existing expensive technology, there's a certain lack of incentive to build something that will throw it all out of business.
Does not that then require us to go look in other places, namely possibly outside of the established political system, outside of the established economic system?
Well, you have in mind what?
How about a new political party in this country?
I've done that.
Well, for those
It's easier to build space planes than to establish a political party that has any chance of winning power in this country.
Particularly if space is the issue.
We often talk of NASA as if they're a monolith, and NASA is not a monolith. At some level, they have some policy direction from the headquarters, but and reference was made a little bit ago to a procurement that came out recently called the Bantam procurement, in which NASA has solicited proposals and received proposals. They've not made selections yet, to the best of my knowledge, for contractors in which their emphasis was on small business contractors, although I don't believe the majors were excluded from bidding, and I'm not quite sure who bid. I know Boeing didn't, and I think Lockheed Martin did, but I'm not sure. But the specification for that system was basically one line. They said, we want to put, and this is a small vehicle, it's not a human carrying vehicle. Well, they said, we want to put 150 kilograms in a 220 nautical mile sun synchronous orbit, and our goal is to achieve that at $1.5 million per launch. That is the entire specification. They said, we don't care how you do it, and the proposal, so the RFP solicited proposals in which the government would partly fund the development of such vehicles, but they were looking for a substantial amount of private investment on the part of the proposers as well. But the point is, they certainly were not telling anybody how to design the system. And to the best of my knowledge, they have no preferred design in that case.
One thing about Bantam that I know is that they had a two-phase thing where they were going to give out two separate phases of grants to people. And when you go and look at the companies that they did phase one, the people that got the money, the program office was in Huntsville. 5 of the companies were in Huntsville. One of the companies was someplace else.
Yeah. Well, no, Rockwell goes to
Well, I'm sure they did.
Yeah, Rocket.
I'd like to speak to why the government and the aerospace companies can't give us C.A.T.S. The decision makers, engineers or pilots or former pilots, they are airplane makers. NASA and the aerospace companies are started out as airplane outfits. So that whenever they try to make an unbiased engineering decision, they'll always wind up giving us a spacecraft design that looks like an airplane. It uses wheels, it uses air-breathing engines, that lands on runways. It's quite unconscious, or largely unconscious, because they've been so successful with airplanes in the past. But all these airplane-like spaceship designs that use wheels and wings and lift surfaces and runways, they all have lousy mass ratios and lousy mass fractions. So they'll always give us tiny payloads, if any payload at all, to orbit. So we'll never get C.A.T.S. for that reason from a big aerospace company or from the government.
Yeah.
What about ask drivers, cheap access to space, providing an infrastructure that would somehow enable us to have a population in space?
The bottom line is we're not here to decide what technology is going to work. If there is a company that wants to invest in mass drivers, great, but this is not a technology issue. This is a policy issue.
Yeah, I would just like to make a comment just so at least to get this point out. Everyone uses the example of IBM and Apple. People will talk about Bill Gates. You have to understand that there is a very significant difference in that type of industry than the one that we're talking about. That type of, when Apple started, how much do you think it cost them to build that computer? And how much investment do you think he needed? And when Gates developed his software for IBM and ended up with essentially a monopoly, how much money do you think he needed for investment? There's a difference in needing $100 million to build one vehicle than needing a few $1,000s to develop an idea. And that is significant. And I think for anyone to believe that the engineering in getting us from the surface of this planet to space is easy is wrong.
It is actually easy, but because of the size of the systems that you're dealing with, yeah, you're in the millions.
It's
rocket science.
It's reasonably expensive. So the point is, you do have a dilemma of needing to develop new technologies and at the same time develop customers.
Richard?
Yeah, well, I think there is another difference in the sense that IBM was continuously developing and improving the mainframe computer up until when the PC came along, and it's still improving the mainframe today, even though the demand is not there. NASA, by contrast, this is a monopoly that has become an anachronism. This is the equivalent of Packard and Duesenberg still in production 40 years later. The other thing is the computer computer industry, I think, is that this was something that was useful to people, useful in running small businesses. Jobs and Wozniak, when they bought out the Apple, they thought they could sell maybe 40,000 a year to medium and small businesses. Well, the thing exploded because you could run a small business out of a home. I worked on a magazine in New York that was originally called Family Computing. It became Home Office Computing because people found this is what the PC could do. You could run a small business out of a home. Now the question is, can you do the equivalent with space? And I don't see that you can. You could develop space tourism. Space tourism is the key, I think, because I know a businessman who once loved Italy. He loved to fly over there, and one day he decided to put in a warehouse for his company here because he loved the place so much. And I think space tourism could do the same thing. But the question is, I don't think the dynamics of the space and the computer industries are the same. I think they are fundamentally different situations.
I'd like to go in a slightly different direction. I want to like you to examine that gray area where there's no possible profit motive for the company, even if the company, say like in your data, David, where the government pays the company to get data, the ultimate need for the data is not a profit motive. And like in the same way, if we decided that we wanted a Mars colony to provide another backup copy of the human race, there's no ultimate profit motive there specifically. So how do you deal with what functions the government does and pays for and sort of controls to some degree, and what functions the private sector controls and pays for?
Well, first off, Bob's Galney's question about if NASA disappeared tomorrow, et cetera, I'm not advocating that the agency disappeared tomorrow. This is not an anarchist or a libertarian. All I'm saying, bottom line, is the government has certain roles which is optimized for, which is exploration, which is precisely those sort of, fulfilling those sort of requirements that only government will do. And clearly there are things the private sector can do better. When you get into the gray area, though, there are no easy answers to those gray area issues.
But we need to focus on them and explore them in more detail.
You are correct.
All right, I'm afraid I have to bring this to an end, at least officially. I have a feeling that the panel will be up here unless we're kicked out of the room. I would like to wrap up certain things that I think that we have some agreement on. Number one, we all believe we should do whatever we can to expedite the achievement of C.A.T.S. Now, let's hope, by the way, that we can. It's not a guarantee that we ever will be able to. So far, we just assume that we will. Secondly, I think we all agree we want to simplify and ease the regulatory structure in general. Third, I do believe that we are agreed that to the extent that we are able to stage manage it, we would like to minimize the extent to which government competes with the private sector. Try to keep the government out of those areas where it's not necessary. And fourth, we don't seem to have complete agreement, but I'm following on the line of this last conversation, plus my deeply felt belief, where there's something is not commercially viable and there's a public policy, there is a role for the government. And that would be, I think, things above Earth orbit. It is a problem indeed to try to separate the third and the fourth, getting the government not to compete with private at the same time doing the things that government ought to do. But the difficulty of that should not stop us from continuing to advocate a role for the government where it's not commercially feasible and is necessary, in our case, for getting humans onto other worlds. I thank you very much for coming. I thank our panel. I thank all the people who are on the net who precipitated this very interesting discussion.
And the party tonight is in room 1344, 10 o'clock.